2019, the world was hit by the contagious coronavirus which started in the Wuhan province of China. A deadly virus whose victims presented with flu-like symptoms affected the respiratory system, suffocating internal organs of patients and causing death to millions. The virus that first spread through Asia and Europe was once thought to be a white man's disease to which the black folk were immune. This was an amorphous wish. In March 2020, Uganda registered its first case of the COVID-19 from a male patient returning from the Arab world through Entebbe International Airport. Soon, the President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni would give his national address that started the real Ugandan story of COVID-19. From March 2020 to late 2021, numerous events unfolded, and Yusuf Serunkuma, a budding writer, political theorist, and academic from Makerere University, Kampala, has penned them in his book Non-Essential Humans, Essay on Governance, Reign and Survival in COVID-19 Uganda. The book offers interesting insight into how the Ugandan government reacted to the virus, the measures deployed to minimize the spread of the virus, the response of the netizens towards government orders, and the consequences of these actions. The lockdown. On Monday, March 31st, Ugandan President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni announced a 14-day nationwide lockdown and curfew from 7 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. The directive took immediate effect. In his book, Serunkuma discusses the consequences this directive carried with it, sending confusion on the roads, especially among passengers. Motorists were arrested and automobiles impounded, crowding a number of police stations across the country. Tens of passengers were stranded in taxi and bus parks due to the directive, since long-distance vehicles, some setting off later in the night, were grounded. Serunkuma further recollects how security people, more especially the local defense unit known as the LDU, a unit of the Uganda People's Defense Forces, the UPDF, battered people on accusations that they had disobeyed lawful orders by the president. They not only wagged people walking during curfew time, but those they found seated outside their homes. Serunkuma cites how the president often returned to give clarifications on his speeches, pardoning the people and ordering security to release them. Museveni would later tell his security people that Ugandans sitting outside their compounds are free to do so because they are home. Serunkuma never forgot the joke that if you don't understand the president's directives, the LDUs shall interpret them for you. Of course, their interpretation or misinterpretation often meant physical injury and sometimes death to the people. The COVID relief. Serunkuma also discusses deeply the COVID-19 food relief dubbed for the vulnerable poor. The naming itself was rather disrespectful, according to the author, but the food stamps seemed a relief to disabled people who were unable to work normally and fend for their families. The idea of food distribution, maize flour and beans started on a rather chaotic note, with legislatures questioning how certain contractors had been selected to supply food to government. But Serunkuma focuses on an equally touching issue: the quality of the food distributed. The flour seemed fair to many, but the beans, malt-colored as they were a big joke and disappointment to the so-called vulnerable poor, who looked forward to something to eat. The speaker then, Rebecca Alitwala Kadaga, called for a probe into the matter. The milk promised to lactating mothers was no-show in many areas. The quality of food aside, Serunkuma also writes about the distribution of it. While the vulnerable poor was said to be border riders, market vendors, taxi operators, saloon operators, and other people in the informal sector from Kampala and neighboring districts, the distribution process wasn't void of contending voices that had been left out. Serunkuma also raises questions on the selection of the so-called urban poor as the only beneficiaries, ignoring people in villages who sold their land to buy motorcycles for those riding them in Kampala. he questions the generalization that people outside Kampala had farmland to collect food to survive on. The politics of food wasn't ignored in Serunkuma's discussion of government relief. 1. The food was used as a weapon of power that only government could avail to those in need. Anyone who wished to offer relief was to do so through government and not the benefactor directly meeting the people, because then they would gather crowds through which the virus could spread, also the government said. Serunkuma, however, points to the selective application of the directive. The irony here was that members of the ruling National Resistance Movement, the NRM party, were allowed to distribute food, while opposition politicians weren't. Of course, Serunkuma laments about the ill treatment meted on Mityana Municipality Member of Parliament, Francis Zake, when he was found distributing food to his starving constituents, contrary to the presidential directive, access to basic services. During the two lockdowns in 2020 and 2021, with a ban on transport, access to health services and food were extremely difficult for majority Ugandans, who were categorized as non-essential and hence had no movement permits. First and foremost, Serunkuma observes that lockdowns as a measure to curb the spread of COVID-19 as implemented in Uganda was copied and pasted without any attempt at domestication. He expressed his liking for Tanzanian President John Pombe Magufuli, now deceased, for trashing lockdowns. He kept his country open, business as usual. The author's argument is that when the European countries announced lockdowns, they had developed systems that permitted their people access to supplies without a hassle. While a Ugandan often walks directly to the market to buy food, the Europeans had an already existing and well-developed online shopping system. So when the Mzungu were home, they could easily get supplies from the market. As for the medical services, Serunkuma also compares what Ugandans went through versus the lockdowns in innovating countries. In Uganda, a patient, expectant mother, people living with HIV and hence required to pick ARVs occasionally from a health center were all required to secure clearance from resident district or city commissioners. The process to get to hospital left several unable to access health services, and yet in developed countries, people under lockdown had access to their personal doctors, and there were standby ambulances to transport any sick person who needed to access a health facility. In Uganda, having a personal doctor is a myth to many. The author is likely to have lived both in Uganda and in Germany at a time the COVID-19 had ravaged the world, and hence his illustrious comparisons in his book, Education and Schools Closure. In his book, Serunkuma also captured the school closure, continued closure, and the lack of logic like with many measures of it. Uganda is known to have had the longest lockdown and closure of academic institutions. Even when our immediate neighbors, the Kenyans, opened school, our president, Museveni, kept schools under lock and key. The objective was to avoid children catching the virus from school and in turn infecting their parents at home. The author has a quarrel with these two for its lack of logic. He says, while homes were thought to be the best place to keep children, in practice they weren't, as parents started taking their children to their workplaces, including markets. Children also played away from home, which in any case increased their level of exposure to the virus. But the decision makers, Serunkuma points, wouldn't feel the parents' pain watching their children age at home because they, those in authority, don't have children or grandchildren in local schools. Many study abroad and others in Uganda's international schools were facilitated to conduct online classes. Not every Ugandan affords an international school. They charge in millions, an average Ugandan cannot afford. The COVID economy. The COVID economy. It is said that in every crisis there is a beneficiary, and COVID-19 was no exception. Serunkuma writes in some detail the avenues through which people profiteered on COVID-19. The forced quarantine that saw hotel occupants part with hundreds of dollars for a place overboard, questionable procurement of hospital supplies, private hospitals stealing from the sick, hiking their fees, and the collapse of people's businesses, among others. In a nutshell, Serunkuma's book is a grumble over the illogical measures employed by the Ugandan government or President Yoweri Museveni as he seemed to take sole decisions to curb COVID-19. The people who sustained injuries from beatings by security people, those who died from injuries sustained during enforcement of COVID-19 measures, those who died because they couldn't access medical care, those whose businesses collapsed and lost jobs, the children who lost 2 years of schooling. The list is long. Their story is documented in this book about a major health epidemic of this century.